Have you ever looked at someone and made a silent judgment based on what you saw without knowing the war they've survived? In a quiet diner on a sleepy Sunday morning, one waitress moves like clockwork, carrying more than just plates of food. Her face tells a story written in scars, but no one asks, no one sees, until the insults begin sharp, public, and cruel. The crowd stays silent until a teenage boy, barely old enough to drive, stands up and says just 6 words that stop the world in its tracks. What could he possibly say to turn shame into pride? To make an entire room finally see? Well, it starts with a scar and ends with something far more powerful. Let me tell you the story of Emma Sullivan. Emma Sullivan stepped into Dottie's diner just after sunrise, the scent of bacon and brewed coffee mixing with a quiet hum of small town chatter. She wore her uniform, black slacks, white shirt, apron crisp and clean, with the precision of someone who used to prepare for combat. It wasn't just a job. For Emma, it was armor. 3 years earlier, she had been Sergeant Emma Sullivan, a decorated combat medic with 2 tours in Afghanistan. Her hands had once pulled bleeding soldiers from the wreckage and had held pressure on open wounds while enemy fire cracked through the air like lightning. She had faced death more times than she could count and lived to carry the proof. The scars stretched across her right cheek and neck in jagged lines, pink and textured, a permanent reminder of the IED explosion that changed everything. She'd thrown herself in front of 2 fellow soldiers when their Humvee was hit. The blast had torn into her, leaving skin that no surgery could fully repair. But Emma didn't hide them. She couldn't. They were stitched into her skin, her story, her survival. After returning home, she applied for dozens of jobs, administrative roles that matched her military training. But each time she walked into an interview, she saw it. The subtle flicker of surprise, the hesitation, the smile that faltered when their eyes landed on her face. The thanks for her service felt hollow when followed by silence. No one ever called back. 6 months passed. The rent came due. Groceries became a calculation. When Dottie's diner offered her a position, Emma took it without flinching. It wasn't the work she trained for, but it was work, and she knew how to serve. She never mentioned the army, never talked about Kabul or the nights she stayed awake tending to broken bodies under flickering lights. She simply showed up, kept her head down, and got the job done. On her name tag, beneath the Emma, was a tiny American flag pin, easy to miss, but never forgotten. Each morning, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, running a comb through her hair and adjusting her collar to hide the worst of the scarring. She didn't bother with makeup anymore. No product could erase the history written into her skin. Still, she smiled. Softly, carefully, not because she felt joy, but because she'd learned long ago that in places where no one smiles, even a small one can be an act of quiet strength. Sunday mornings at Dottie's Diner were always the same. Church crowds in freshly pressed clothes, families with restless kids, and the faint scent of old coffee lingering beneath the buzz of ceiling fans. Emma moved through it all like a steady current, a pitcher of orange juice in one hand and 3 hot plates balanced effortlessly on her arm. She didn't look at their faces, not directly. She had learned that eye contact invited discomfort, either theirs or hers. Instead, she focused on the plates, the table numbers, and the rhythm of her steps, 1 foot in front of the other. Breathe in, count to 4. Breathe out, count to 6. She reached a corner booth and began to slide pancakes in front of a little girl in pink. That's when she heard it. A whisper. Not soft enough. Why would they hire someone who looks like that? A second voice followed. Ruins my appetite completely. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't allow herself to. But the pitcher in her hand trembled, sending tiny ripples across the orange juice. She kept her back straight, her smile neutral, and turned away without a word. The plates were still hot, her hand stung slightly, and for a split second, she welcomed the distraction. Behind the counter, Dottie, owner, boss, and self-proclaimed people person, watched from her perch by the register, her lips thinned, but not in sympathy. She looked at Emma as if the fault lay not in the words spoken, but in Emma's very presence. A mother and child passed by, heading to the restrooms. The boy, maybe 5, pointed openly at Emma's face. "Mommy, what happened to that lady?" The mother yanked him by the wrist. "Don't stare," she scolded, her voice loud enough to reach half the diner. It's rude to look at people like that. Emma forced a smile again, lips barely moving. Her breath caught in her throat for a beat, but she swallowed hard and returned to the counter. No one offered a kind glance. No one said a word in her defense. In war, she had faced enemy fire. Here, she faced something slower, but just as cutting. Order up for table 7, the cook called from the window. Emma grabbed the plates, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the window. Her name tag gleamed under the overhead light, the tiny American flag beneath her name catching a glint of morning sun. A small symbol, mostly ignored. Still, it was hers. "Can we get some more coffee over here?" a man at table 5 called out, waving a hand. Emma turned, already reaching for the pot. As she neared, his expression changed. He pulled his hand back, his nose wrinkling in visible recoil. She didn't react, just poured the coffee and turned away before his disgust could turn into words. She found herself moving faster now, not to serve more tables, but to retreat. The bathroom offered a moment's escape. Inside, she gripped the sink and stared into the mirror. Harsh fluorescent lights revealed every curve of her scars. The skin on her cheek was taut, pulling slightly at the corner of her right eye, creating a permanent dimple that looked more like a dent. She touched it out of habit, not vanity, just curiosity, as if still surprised it hadn't faded. But she hadn't truly seen these scars in years. She had stopped seeing them. Why couldn't anyone else? Her therapist had warned her it might be like this. Coming home didn't always mean returning. Not really. You could come home and still feel like you were in a combat zone. Except here, the wounds weren't from bullets or bombs. They came from words, glances, silence. She rinsed her face with cold water. Count to 4. Count to 6. The rhythm had kept her alive once. Maybe it still could. When she stepped back into the dining room, no one looked up. The world spun on, coffee being poured, eggs being salted, receipts being signed, as if her existence was nothing more than a ripple in their routine. But one person was looking. At table 9, a teenage boy sat with his family. He watched her, not like the others, not with pity or curiosity. He was looking into her eyes, not her scars, not her uniform, just Emma felt it like a pause in the storm, a flicker of something different. She adjusted her apron and moved forward. The day wasn't over yet. Emma hadn't even made it halfway through her shift when the next blow came. Not from a customer, but from someone wearing the same uniform. Melissa, the other waitress on duty, had always kept a polite distance from Emma. She never said anything cruel, but her eyes told a different story. This morning, she had started skimming tables from Emma's assigned section, gliding over with practiced charm, smiling wide at customers who had avoided Emma's gaze minutes earlier. "Table 4 needs a refill," Melissa said, her voice carefully neutral as she set down a tray. "But maybe I should take it. They seem particular." Emma understood what she meant. Particular was code. It always was. It meant the guests didn't want to look at her, didn't want their children asking questions, didn't want to be reminded that the world was brutal and unfair, even while they sipped orange juice in clean clothes. "I can handle my section," Emma replied softly, reaching for the coffee pot. Alyssa didn't argue. She just nodded and turned away, already on her way to another table that, by rights, should have been Emma's. Emma approached table 4 with slow, measured steps, her grip on the pot tightened to keep her hand from trembling. The man sitting there wore a pastel golf shirt and a tan visor. He didn't look up at first, until he caught a glimpse of her in his peripheral vision. "Isn't there someone normal who can bring our food?" he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Emma froze. She had faced down bleeding soldiers screaming in agony and had cradled men while they bled out in the dirt, whispering promises she couldn't keep. But this, a stranger's careless cruelty, somehow pierced deeper. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll see if someone else can assist you." His companion, a woman with immaculately curled hair and heavy diamonds on her fingers, added sharply, "It's just, we're trying to eat. You understand, right? It's distracting." Distracting, like a stain, like noise. Emma nodded slowly, retreating one step, then another. 7 steps. That was all she could manage before she reached the threshold of the kitchen. She didn't cry, not yet, not where they could see. But her eyes burned. and her chest ached in that quiet, suffocating way she remembered from nights spent under fire, when you held your breath because even breathing felt too loud. Dottie intercepted her just as she reached the swinging kitchen door. Emma, honey, can I have a word? Emma followed her into the staff office. The space smelled of cigarettes masked by artificial lavender spray. Dottie shuffled papers, avoiding her eyes. Look, I value your work ethic, she began as if reciting a line rehearsed in her head. I do, but customers are uncomfortable, and we can't afford that. Emma stood still, the coffee pot in her hand. So what are you saying? Maybe, maybe we could move you to kitchen duty, Dottie suggested gently, or evening shifts, when it's darker, quieter, so she wouldn't be seen. Not by the Sunday crowd, not by the mothers with questions to hush, not by the customers who didn't want to look at the price of courage. Emma didn't argue. She didn't have the energy. The words dropped like shrapnel, but her face stayed still. I'll finish my shift, she said simply, and walked out. Back on the floor, things had returned to their version of normal. Forks clinked, coffee steamed. Nobody noticed the change in her gait, the slight slump of her shoulders, except for the boy in table 9. He was still watching, maybe 16. His eyes were soft but focused, like he saw something the rest of the world missed. Emma returned to the routine. Clear plates, pour drinks, smile when you don't feel it, until laughter broke through her focus like glass. At table 8, a group of men in khakis and polo shirts were chuckling too loudly. One of them nudged his friend and gestured toward her. Hey, Jim, remember that horror movie we watched last week? He said. The main character kinda looked like. He jerked his thumb toward Emma's face. The group burst into laughter. One man looked uncomfortable, his smile faltering, but he didn't say a word. They never did. Emma didn't respond. She didn't flinch or change pace, but something inside her shifted, like a tightrope starting to fray. No one in that diner knew what her scars truly meant, that they were born from heroism. The military had called her actions extraordinary. Her willingness to risk her life to pull wounded comrades out of fire. She had dragged a bleeding soldier across nearly 100 yards of open ground, shielding his body with hers as a second explosion detonated. She had done it knowing she wouldn't come out whole. And now she was being mocked like a sideshow attraction. She moved on, not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to keep moving, even when you were dying inside. They arrived just before the lunch rush, a group of 4 men in loud golf shirts, the kind who laughed too much and tipped too little. Their voices preceded them, brash and entitled, filling the diner like an unwanted draft. Emma saw them being seated in her section and instinctively braced herself. One of them, broad-shouldered and sunburned, leaned back in his chair, waving an empty glass overhead. Hey, Scarface, can we get some service over here? He barked. The insult sliced through the noise like a blade. The conversation around them stalled. A few people looked up. Most looked away. Emma walked over, her notepad steady in her hand, her smile locked in place like armor forged in silence. Welcome to Dottie's. What can I get you today? She asked. The man smirked. What happened to your face? He said, his tone mocking. Bar fight? Car crash? Another one leaned in. I'm guessing motorcycle accident, or maybe she spilled something hot in the kitchen. Probably wasn't even in combat. Emma's jaw tensed. She had heard it all before, variations on the same cruel curiosity, delivered with a laugh or a sneer, never with kindness. I recommend the pancake special, she replied calmly, or the country breakfast with sausage. It comes with... I asked you a question, the man interrupted, dropping his voice to something darker, heavier. What's wrong with your face? The words hit her like shrapnel. The way he said it, what's wrong, as if she were broken, a defect on the assembly line of acceptable appearances. The diner seemed to fall into a hush again. Emma felt it like eyes crawling across her skin. Behind the counter, Dottie pretended to be absorbed in the receipt printer. Melissa had vanished into the kitchen. Emma took a slow breath. I was injured while serving in Afghanistan, she said softly. Now, about your order. Afghanistan? The man scoffed. You were probably just on kitchen duty and spilled soup on yourself. Woman in combat. What a joke. Emma's hand trembled. Her pen scratched uneven lines across the page. She had saved lives under fire. She had used her own body as a shield. She had held men's hands while they died, and now she was being laughed at for surviving. I'll give you, gentlemen, a moment to decide, she said, turning to walk away. No, wait, the first man said, grinning wide. He swiped his water glass off the table, knocking it to the floor with a loud shatter. Look what you made me do with your shaking. Clean it up. Emma stared at the shards scattered across the floor. She knelt, slowly, cheeks burning as she began to gather the pieces. Her fingers brushed against jagged edges, and she welcomed the sting. Anything to distract from the humiliation pressing against her chest like a vice. That's when Dottie's voice rang out across the diner, sharp and decisive. Emma, that's enough? Emma paused. The glass was still in her hands. I need you to clock out, Dottie continued, walking over with forced calm. You're making people uncomfortable. Ella blinked. She rose slowly, the words hitting her harder than the insults. I haven't finished my shift, she said, her voice flat. I'm sorry, Dottie said, but she couldn't meet Emma's eyes. It's just not working out. These disruptions, they're bad for business. Emma stood there, still holding the broken pieces. Her hands were red now, whether from pressure or a cut, she didn't know. The pain was irrelevant. You're firing me because of how I look, she said, not asking, just stating. Dottie looked down. I'm doing what's best for the diner. And that was it. No defense, no kindness, no acknowledgement of service, just discomfort, just business. The silence in the diner was thick now. People watched without watching, eyes darting, pretending not to see what was unfolding in front of them. A few looked down at their plates. Most said nothing. That was when Tyler stood. The teenage boy from table 9, silent until now, rose from his booth. He looked young, too young to carry the weight in his chest. His mother reached for him, whispering, Tyler, sit down. But he gently pulled away. Can I say something? He asked aloud. His voice cracked with nerves, but the room was so quiet it echoed. Every head turned. He looked at Emma, then back to the crowd, and then he said 6 words that changed everything. She saved my father's life, twice. The stillness deepened. Forks stopped midair. The men at table 8 blinked like they were trying to understand another language. Tyler pulled a folded photo from his wallet. His hand shook slightly, but he held it high. This is my dad, he said. Captain Michael James, 10th Mountain Division, 2 Purple Hearts. He turned the photo to Emma, revealing an image of a smiling soldier with his arm around a younger version of her. Emma, before the scars, in full uniform, pride shining in her eyes. He told me stories about her, about how she pulled him from a burning Humvee, how she shielded him from a second blast, how she carried him to safety when no one else could. That's why he's alive. Tyler's voice grew stronger. Those scars you're all staring at, that's what heroism looks like. Emma couldn't speak, couldn't move. Her throat tightened, and for the first time in a long time, the tears she always held back spilled freely. Across the diner, something began to shift. An elderly man stood slowly. His back was straight, his hand rising in a formal salute. I served in Vietnam, he said, his voice rough with age and shame. 48 years ago. I've been sitting here watching this happen and saying nothing. I'm sorry for my cowardice today. Emma's breath caught. A woman near the door wiped her eyes. I'm so ashamed, she whispered. Even the men who had mauled Emma stared down at their plates now, their laughter dissolved into silence. Tyler walked up to her, holding the photo close to his chest. My father always said, he said quietly, if you ever meet Sergeant Emma Sullivan, you thank her for me. For a long moment, the diner was still. The usual clatter of forks and coffee cups, the low murmur of conversation, even the hiss from the kitchen, all of it faded into the background. Emma stood in the center of it all, scarred and trembling, holding shards of broken glass in her reddened hands. But something had changed. The silence wasn't judgment anymore. It was reverence. Tyler's words still floated in the air like smoke. She saved my father's life twice. Emma felt something loosen in her chest, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. She looked at the photograph in the boy's hand. herself, before the blast, before the pain, before the years of being invisible and unwanted. It didn't feel like looking at a stranger. It felt like looking into a mirror she hadn't dared glance into in years. And then the old veteran lowered his salute and took a step toward her. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said. "We see you now, ma'am, and we're damn grateful." He wasn't the only one. Tyler's mother slowly rose from their booth, placing a hand on her son's back. Her eyes glistened with tears, and when she met Emma's gaze, she nodded. Not with pity, but with quiet respect. A woman from table 3 stood next, then a couple from near the door. One by one, like candles catching flame, the patrons rose to their feet. No one said a word. They didn't have to. Emma's eyes scanned the room. Where once there had only been stares of discomfort, now there were faces softened by understanding. Even the men who had mocked her sat frozen in their seats, their arrogance hollowed out by a boy's truth. Dottie stood behind the counter, her authority visibly crumbling under the weight of her silence. She walked slowly toward Emma, her expression no longer stern, but unsteady. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I never asked. I should have." Emma didn't answer, not out of anger, but because the words didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that someone had finally stood up. Someone had finally seen her. Tyler looked up at her then, and his voice was smaller now, unsure again. "I just thought people should know." She crouched down slightly, enough to meet him eye to eye. "You did more than that," she said softly. "You reminded them who we are." Applause erupted, tentative at first, then swelling, uncontainable. Not for Emma's service at Dottie's diner, not for the way she carried pancakes or refilled coffee, but for her courage, for what she had endured silently, day after day, and for the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. That day, everything shifted. Dottie's diner, once a place where Emma was merely tolerated, transformed. A new sign appeared in the front window within the week. "Proudly serving veterans, all are welcome here." My mom didn't stay long after that. A representative from the local Veterans Affairs office had been in the diner that morning. He reached out the following Monday. They offered her a position, communications coordinator for their outreach program. "We need people who understand what it means to come home changed," they told her. Emma did, more than anyone. On her last day at Dottie's, the diner filled with familiar faces, not the ones who had laughed, but the ones who had stood. People brought envelopes, cards, and folded tips. Some came to say sorry, some could barely look her in the eye, but they came. Even Dottie, rough as ever, handed Emma a small wrapped frame. Inside was a portrait, a painting by a local artist. It was Emma in her waitress uniform, but behind her was an American flag, its folds painted in quiet waves. In her eyes was the strength of a soldier, in her stance the steadiness of someone who never broke. "So we never forget what service really looks like," Dottie said. Emma didn't cry. She didn't need to. Something deeper had settled inside her, something stronger than forgiveness. A sense of finally being seen, not for what she'd lost, but for who she still was. Tyler and his family began visiting her often at the VA. His father, Captain Michael James, came with him one afternoon, walking with a slight limp, his voice calm but fierce. They worked together on a program to help veterans transition back into civilian life. Emma's story was no longer silent. It became a bridge for others, and she finally stopped hiding her scars. 6 months later, Emma stood behind a wooden podium in the packed auditorium of the local high school. The red, white, and blue of the stage decorations felt almost too bright beneath the overhead lights. Rows of students filled the seats, fidgeting in their chairs, half listening to patriotic music still playing faintly from the speakers. Veterans Day was usually just a day off for most of them. An assembly they sat through, clapping politely at names they didn't recognize. But today was different. Emma spotted Tyler in the front row. He stood at attention, hands by his sides, chin raised slightly like a young cadet. And beside him sat Captain Michael James, taller than his son, slower in movement but unmistakably proud. They had both come to support her. Tyler took the stage first. His voice had deepened a little since that day in the diner, but his sincerity hadn't changed. Heroes don't always wear uniforms, he said. Sometimes they wear aprons. Sometimes they carry plates of pancakes while carrying scars the rest of us can't even imagine. Then he turned, nodded to Emma, and stepped aside. She walked up slowly, not from nerves, but because every step carried weight. No shame. Not fear, just memory. Her speech was brief, but no one forgot it. I used to hide my scars, she began, her voice steady. I used to see them as a punishment, as a reminder of the pain, the fire, the moment everything changed. She paused, running her fingers gently along the line of raised tissue on her jaw, not out of shame, but recognition. But scars don't make us ugly. They tell the story of a battle we survived, often so that someone else could live. Her gaze drifted to Tyler and his father. The boy nodded once, eyes wet but unblinking. I spent years thinking people wouldn't understand, that if they looked at me, they only see what was broken. But one day, someone spoke up. Just 6 words, and the world stopped long enough to finally listen. A quiet stillness settled over the room. Every one of you will face moments, she continued, when doing the right thing feels hard, feels lonely. But that moment, that's your chance to stand up, to speak the truth, to see someone, see them. When Emma stepped away from the podium, the applause wasn't loud. It was powerful, a wave that grew from silence, not for show, but for reverence. Across town, Dottie's diner had changed. One wall, once decorated with faded photos and retro signs, had been transformed into a wall of honor, a collage of framed portraits and service photos of local veterans. In the center, under a soft light, hung Emma's picture. She wasn't in uniform. She was wearing her waitress apron, holding a coffee pot, with the faintest smile pulling at the corner of her lips. Behind her, painted with gentle brushstrokes, the American flag rippled like memory. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Courage serves daily." Customers stopped to read it now. Children asked about the woman in the photo, and Dottie, rough edge as ever, always told the story with a little more care in her voice. Emma, now working full-time at the VA office, never asked to be honored. She didn't need the spotlight. Her mission had simply changed. From patching wounds on the battlefield to reminding the wounded at home they weren't alone. And every week, without fail, Tyler and his father came by to volunteer. The boy who once stood in a diner, voice shaking but heart steady, had found his calling too. Because sometimes it only takes 6 words to bring dignity back to someone who had been cast into the shadows. Sometimes a scar isn't the end of a story. It's the place where the story begins again, with strength, with truth, and with someone brave enough to see the beauty in broken things.